Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Game 7 of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Liren. It's a fantastic match so far. 6 games have been played. The score is 3-3. And today it's Jan Nepomniachtchi playing with the white pieces. We have seen so far 4 decisive games. And let's see what Game 7 will offer us. Nepo playing with the white pieces, as I said, and returns to his favorite move 1e4. And in previous games, Black responded here with the move e5. It's his main repertoire, but for this occasion, Liren decided to switch back to one of his old favorite lines against 1e4, the French defense, 1e6. And that's actually quite interesting because Nepo used the French defense also in the candidates tournament to win it eventually and get the right to play Magnus Carlsen a few years ago. So Nepo also playing against his own opening. We get to see the Tarrasch variation with a knight on d2. And Black plays in the principled way c5. Knight gf3, c takes d4, knight takes d4. This is all well-known stuff. Basically, Black has a choice now between either knight c6 or developing the king's knight first, which was played by Ding. E takes d5, knight takes d5. And now the knight from d2, which is not doing too well, moves to f3 so that the bishop from c1 can get out. In the vast majority of games, the move bishop b4 has been played here, but bishop e7 is perfectly playable as well. And interestingly, we get a quite open position, open center, no fixed pawn formations. And, well, that's quite promising. White played bishop c4. And now, instead of the natural move castling, Ding played here first the move knight c6, which looks like a remarkable decision. But after knight takes c6, b takes c6, you would think this is an isolated pawn, it's a weakness. But it's not easy to attack it at all, and we will see that the pawn on the c-file will be actually quite useful for Black. White castled, Black did the same here. And now White is about to build up an attack against the Black king, so he will try to guide its own pieces in that direction. Bishop b7, the bishop will be nicely placed on the long diagonal later on. And here the novelty, the move bishop d3. In an earlier game, White had played the move knight e5, which is also fine. But in fact, the bishop was not doing that much on c4 any longer. It is much better placed on h7, looking at the Black king. Black played queen c7. In certain cases, looking at ideas of knight f4, for instance. But most importantly, Black is connecting the rooks. And they will try to come to the d-file very soon. But now, queen e4, threatening checkmate. The game is starting, guys. Black played knight f6, defending against that mating threat. Maybe g6 is also interesting, but knight f6 makes sense as well to bring the knight back. And now, apart from defending the pawn on h7, you're also attacking the queen, of course. So the queen comes to h4. And now White has a very simple plan of trying to eliminate that knight on f6 and then renew the mating threat. And Black could, for instance, play a move like rook a8 now, but then bishop f4 is quite annoying, and offering the exchange of bishops is not such a good idea because of bishop g5. And there are a lot of problems defending the knight. If you would move the queen away, then the main problem is that the bishop on e7 is no longer defended by the queen. And it runs this time into bishop takes h7, a very nice deflection motive. With the idea that after knight takes, queen takes e7, White is a big pawn up. So rook a8 would be a careless move, but Ding played very accurately in the middle game. Played here the move c5. This pawn is very important. And opening up the diagonal for the bishop, and possibly the bishop will trade itself for the knight on f3. Now if you would proceed here with bishop g5 with the idea to take on f6 and mate on h7, probably the best here is h6. And after bishop takes, h6 brutal piece sacrifice, g takes, queen takes, there's probably nothing better than just a repetition of moves. With a number of queen checks, the black king is relatively safe. So Nepo instead played here bishop f4, developing the bishop with gain of time as well, threatening the queen. And now the move queen b6 was played. Interestingly, the machines, they really strongly prefer the move queen d8. When the bishop on e7 remains defended, and there are later ideas of maybe playing g6 followed by knight h5. But queen b6 played, and well, queen d8 was perhaps a bit better, but queen b6 is also playable. And there are a lot of tactical ideas coming up now. For instance, the bishop on e7 is not longer defended, and bishop takes h7 could be a possibility. But after knight takes, queen takes e7, white is a pawn up, but black will regain the pawn, take on f3, gf3, and queen takes b2. And if you take on c5, white is still a pawn up, but black is likely to regain it, and well, there's no longer any attack. So bishop takes h7 is not a problem. There are other moves. For instance, bishop g5 could be played anyway. And now the point is that bishop takes f3 runs into this move, bishop takes f6, and you have a problem as both pawn on h7 as well as the bishop on e7 are hanging. Instead, you could consider h6. But then after bishop takes h6, g takes, queen takes, it's very likely that white is going to make a repetition here with queen g5, queen h6. It's only a draw. Nepo was not looking for that. He instead played a move knight e5. Very interesting idea, as white is actually threatening to give a knight fork on d7, attacking the queen and the rook, and of course also trying to deflect the knight from f6, because the knight needs to retain control over the h7 pawn. So placing a rook on the d file would be very natural, but if you play rook f d8, it's actually a mistake. It runs into bishop takes h7, knight takes h7, and queen takes e7. And white has won a pawn and even threatens to take on f7 with check and mate to follow. So Ding instead played rook a8, and this is very precise, because now that same idea with bishop takes h7, knight takes, queen takes e7, white is a pawn up, but there is the move f6, attacking the knight, and the rook on f8 covers the f7 square, so the queen cannot go there. If you move the knight away, attacking the rook, there is rook f7, and look, this queen is trapped. Black wins material. If white wants, he could still try to defend here with rook a1. And now the knight on e5 cannot really be taken because of bishop takes e5, threatening mate. And well, if the knight blocks it, there is rook takes d8. If you take back with the queen, the bishop is hanging. But if you take with the rook, there's bishop c7, and the rook and queen are hanging. White is winning. So the correct line would be, instead of f takes e5, to play rook d2 e8, attacking the queen. The knight on e5 is hanging as well. And after queen d7, the best is to make a repetition of moves, as the queen got to keep an eye on that pawn on g7. Very tricky line, but bishop takes h7 was not played for that reason. Instead, rook a2 e1. Interesting idea, maybe rook f e1 could be played as well, but Nepo has some idea with this rook later on. And of course, one of the ideas could be that if black is playing too slow, that you bring over a rook along the third rank and generate some mating threats against the pawn on h7. So for that reason, black tries to anticipate it by playing the move g6. I should also point out that the pawn on b2 can never really be taken. Because of rook b1, we have a very cute switch as the bishop on b7 hangs. So g6 played, and closing the diagonal, so no pressure against the pawn on h7 any longer, but the bishop comes to g5 to attack the knight. Very logical idea. And of course, if you would play king g7, there are ideas to play bishop h6, winning the exchange, or even knight g4 increasing the pressure on the knight. And if black captures, there's bishop takes e7 and everything is hanging in black's position. So now the game is heating up. After the move bishop g5, black played here rook to d4, attacking the queen, and if the attack will come to an end, then black's pieces are very actively placed. So rook d4 is an excellent move. You would like to play f4, but that weakens the king, the diagonal to the king. There is c4, attacking the bishop, and there will be a discovered check on the next move. The rook can capture the bishop. So instead, white played the move queen h3. And now you're looking for counterplay. And Ding comes up with a great solution. He played queen c7, keeping an eye on the knight, although the knight is still defended. But the main point is that c4 is a very important resource, trying to force the bishop to leave the d3 square. And that explains the move b3 to cover the c4 square. c3 is another interesting move, but it weakens the bishop on d3 a bit, and black is happy to go rook d5, attacking the knight on e5. And after something like f4 now, a typical idea here for black could be to play c4, sacrificing the pawn, with the idea that if you take with the bishop, the rook enters. With massive threats against the pawn on g2, maybe the bishop comes to c5. For just one pawn, black has tremendous counterplay against white's king. Of course, you could take with a knight, but after rook fd8, the bishop is quite vulnerable. And black is doing quite okay. We have managed to fend off the attack and looking for counterplay along the open d file. So Nepo went for b3 instead. It's a better move. And now we see another point of having the queen on c7 as we are preparing knight h5, which was played trying to exchange the dark squared bishops. Very nice move. And the knight is doing well, because if bishops would be swapped, the knight can later come to f4. And now Nepo played f4. So hoping that after bishop takes g5, f takes g5, there is potential counterplay on the f file. But things are incredibly sharp. Black is still doing okay here if he plays knight f4. And now after queen h6, this all had to be calculated, incredibly complex. If you do take the pawn on g2, it's a poison pawn, because there is bishop takes g6, fantastic blow, opening up black's king. Black cannot take with the f pawn because it leads to rook takes f8 with mate. And if you take with the h pawn, there's knight takes g6, threatening checkmate, and once again the knight cannot be taken because of rook takes f8. Instead, a move like c4 leads to insane complications, and probably it's still doable for black. But the move played by Ding, it's quite more human, I would say. He played here the move bishop d6, so that there is also still pressure against the pawn on f4, against the knight on e5. In certain cases, you even got to reckon with f6, although such moves are not that simple to play, because also the pawn on e6 could be hanging afterwards. But the drawback of bishop d6 is that the rook is a bit vulnerable. So white played c3. The rook can no longer retreat along the d-file. If you play rook d5, for instance, there is bishop e4. Attacking the rook again. If the rook goes now to d2, we trade off the bishops on b7. And white breaks through with f5. He's about to take on e6, but most importantly now the rook on d2 is under threat. So white breaks through and all his pieces are fantastically placed. So instead, and this had all been calculated by both players, they followed the move knight takes f4, ignoring the threat of the rook, threatening to take on h3. And this is a crucial moment because the knight can be taken in two possible ways. Nepo decided to take with the bishop, but perhaps rook takes f4 also is quite interesting. If you take with the rook on f4, there's bishop takes f4 and the knight is saved, white is a piece up. But instead, bishop takes e5 is a good move. And if you would take on d4 now, the rook, there's bishop takes f4, the position gets opened, no longer there's any attack, black is in great shape. But instead, there's fantastic shot here with bishop takes g6. What is going on? You're threatening mate on h7, so the bishop cannot stay on the board. If f takes g6, there is queen takes e6, king g7, rook takes f8. And if you take the rook now, there's bishop h6 with checkmate or winning material. If you go bishop g7, it's queen e8 with mate. Instead, you could consider taking with the h-pawn. And now after c takes d4, don't take the rook because there's bishop f6 and you're getting mated again. So incredible, difficult lines to work out for Ding. And also for Nepo, of course. And, well, if you take on d4 instead, maybe bishop f6 is a good move. Trying to threaten mate once again. And if you take here, such position is probably still holdable. Queen h4, rook h8. If the queen moves, pawn on h2 is hanging. But after queen f4, such an endgame is doable for black. Was not played. Nepo was trying to maintain the pressure on Ding. Played very fast the move bishop takes f4. But I believe it's not so great. Rook takes f4. Fantastic idea. As we get to see, once again in the match, a positional exchange sacrifice. White has a rook, black an extra bishop, and an extra pawn. But look at these bishops, they are fantastic pieces. Nepo played rook h4, going after the pawn on h7, but there is rook d8. Excellent move. So if you take on h7, there is a rook takes d3, and the queen cannot retain control over both the rook on h7 as well as the bishop on d3. So white played bishop e4, offering the exchange of bishops. That's a good idea. And black is for a choice. He could consider keeping the bishops on the board. It's not a strange idea at all. But getting lower on time, Ding decided to swap the bishop. So now the attack is more or less over. And white is an exchange up. But how to evaluate this position? Well, I believe that despite the extra rook, white is unable to create any serious threats. There are no open files. The only open file is occupied by black. And I think this bishop is a great piece. And also the king is quite safe. And it's very important that with this move rook d5, Ding is trying to provoke white to play the move c4. To force the rook to leave, and then the bishop on e5 is hanging. But there is bishop d4 check. You're anchoring the bishop in the middle of the board. After king h1, there's something like rook h5 with excellent play. The bishop is absolutely fine. Only black can be better here. So that's why Nepo played rook h4, but I think the rook is going into the wrong direction. Black played queen d6. Excellent move. Queen and rook working together with the point that the pawn cannot be taken. There is rook d1. And there are huge back rank problems. If the rook is getting off the board, the queen is able to enter with a lot of checks. And this rook is completely misplaced. There are no threats because the bishop is guarding the h8 square. I think Nepo realized that too late. Now switched plans, decided to centralize the queen instead. But then you can also see that his last move, rook h4, was quite unfortunate. And with this move, you're preventing black from moving the rook from d5. If rook d3, the bishop is hanging. So black instead played here h5. Excellent move. Consolidating, preventing also any kind of ideas based on queen h6. So h5 is a good move. And, well, white would love to bring the rook back. But if the rook moves, the pawn on h2 is also hanging. So I like the cooperation between black's forces. If h3, by the way, to move the rook from h4, there's bishop g3 and the rooks are hanging. So that explains the move g3. But it's also a small concession regarding the king's safety. Bishop f6 hitting the rook, rook c4. And now both players were getting lower on time. Maybe Ding had around a few minutes left here. And Nepo around 10, 11 minutes. And there's absolutely zero problem for black. If he plays a move like king g7, I fail to come up with a constructive plan. And at the right moment, there are ideas trying to infiltrate. But Ding had some ideas with the move h4. He really wanted to open up the white's king's position. And instantly G takes h4 played by Nepo. And now, bizarre thing happened. Ding started to think here for quite some minutes. 2 minutes, 1 minute, and he was under 1 minute to reach move 40. He was completely stuck, completely frozen at the board, and he probably realized that there was some idea he had in mind and it doesn't really work. But there are still moves like bishop e5 or rook h5 which are both okay. But instead he played rook d2, threatening mate, but now rook e2 on the board. White would love to welcome the exchange of rooks. And still, I think that he underestimated Ding, that after rook d1, king g2, the king is absolutely safe. It's being surrounded by its own major pieces. If there's a check on the diagonal, queen e4 could be played, and any possible exchange will favor white. So that's something he didn't want. He could still avoid the exchange of rooks, come back to d5 to protect the pawn and take it from there, but we all know it's very difficult to admit a mistake in chess, but also in life, of course. Ding played rook d3, but this was a huge mistake because there is queen takes c5. Winning a pawn and the queen is active, offering the exchange of queens, and Ding getting down to half a minute here. He doesn't want to exchange queens, played rook d1. Check. And now you got to be careful. If the king goes to f2, there's queen takes h2. Nepo took his time, of course, spotted that little problem, played king g2, so the pawn is still defended. And now queen d3. The queen entered, attacking the rook on e2. But there's rook f2, and look, once again at white's pieces, they are fantastically controlling so many squares. And the rook guards the king, there's no possible check. If you move the bishop, because the bishop is under threat, so let's say you go bishop d8 or so, there's rook d4. And white initiates more exchanges. Ding, with only a few seconds on the clock, played here the move king g7, protecting the bishop. But now after rook cf4, the rooks are connected, finally. They have a half-open file. They are threatening to take the bishop. If the bishop goes away, the pawn on f7 can be taken. Black's position is falling apart. And once again, the queen and rook, they look very active. But if there are no checks, there's nothing to gain. White fantastically succeeded in combining the attack and defense at the same time with its major pieces. And with few seconds on the clock, Ding offered his hand, resigned here. And that was a painful loss. He could have continued here with a move like queen takes c3, for instance. But after queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes f7, such an endgame is definitely lost. So what an incredible game with so many hidden tactical resources for both sides. It looked like Nepo overplayed his hand and Ding got fantastic counter chances. And later on, in this position, with this exchange sacrifice, he was absolutely in control. Miscalculated. And how is it possible to lose such position in just less than 10 moves? That's absolutely remarkable. It must have to do something with the huge pressure on the clock, also with the change of the situation. Yeah, you were under pressure, all of a sudden you realize the attack is over, how to cope with that. And it's remarkable that such a strong player just absolutely freezes at the board. And I think that can only happen in a World Championship match. Nepo takes the lead. It's 4-3. Tomorrow is another rest day, but then we are back with game 8. Hopefully we'll get to see many more games. In total there are 14 games to be played if the match is not decided beforehand. If one player reaches 7.5, the match is over. 4-3 it is now. If the match is tied at the end, 7-7, we will get to see tie breaks. I cannot wait to see many more games to be played between these two guys. See you soon. Bye bye.